The Senate Judiciary Committee room felt different that morning, like the air itself carried tension. Every seat was full, every camera light blinking red, every reporter waiting for something big. Governor Ron DeSantis sat straight at the witness table, a confident smile fixed on his face. He looked calm, prepared, and ready to fight. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, her hands folded neatly on a stack of papers that looked ordinary, but were anything but. She didn't move much, didn't speak yet, but her eyes stayed locked on him. Everyone in the room could sense the silent electricity between them. This was not going to be a regular hearing. The clock hit 10 a.m. sharp when Chairman Whitehouse struck the gavel. The sharp sound echoed through the chamber. "The committee will come to order," he said. Cameras zoomed in. Journalists leaned forward. Governor DeSantis cleared his throat and began his opening statement. His tone was firm but smooth, the practiced rhythm of someone used to commanding attention. He spoke about state sovereignty, about how the Constitution gave states the right to run their own elections. He called federal oversight unnecessary and dangerous. For 15 minutes, he painted himself as the defender of democracy's structure, quoting legal phrases and statistics, his words flowing like water over polished stone. He was methodical, confident, unshakable. The senators nodded, some impressed, others skeptical. When he finally paused, the room gave a respectful silence. That was when he turned his words directly toward Jasmine Crockett. "Representative," he said, smiling faintly, "can you name a single provision in your home state's election laws that prevents any legal voter from casting a ballot?" The question hung in the air like bait. Reporters recognized it instantly. It was a trap. If she hesitated, he'd look stronger. If she stumbled, he'd win the narrative. For 3 seconds, she didn't move. Then she reached for the microphone and spoke, her voice steady and calm. "Governor," she said, "I have the transcript of your sworn testimony from Davis versus Florida last year. In that testimony, you admitted that some provisions of your own state's laws could prevent eligible citizens from voting. Would you like me to read your exact words to the committee?" The room froze. DeSantis' smile flickered just slightly, and every camera in the room caught it. That 1 second was all it took for everyone to realize this was not going to be an easy exchange. The audience could feel something shift. The controlled rhythm of his testimony had just met an opponent who knew his every step. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to know who Jasmine Crockett was. She wasn't just another politician with a headline bill. She had been a civil rights lawyer in Texas, walking into courtrooms where no one expected her to win, and walking out having rewritten the odds. She fought for people who couldn't afford lawyers, for voters who stood in lines that stretched for miles, for communities told they didn't matter. Her new proposal, the Federal Voter Protection Act, wasn't a theory. It was a lifetime of fieldwork turned into law. "This isn't about partisanship," she had said earlier. "It's about every American's right to vote, free of barriers." DeSantis, on the other hand, had built his brand on control, order, and a promise of integrity. A Harvard-trained lawyer and former naval officer, he saw elections as a battlefield that needed discipline. Under his watch, Florida adopted some of the strictest election laws in the country. He said they prevented fraud. Critics said they suppressed votes. He called it protecting democracy. Others called it fencing it in. When these two met, it was never going to be polite. It was going to be explosive. Back in the hearing, DeSantis leaned forward. "Representative, my position is simple. The Constitution gives states control of elections. That's not opinion. That's law." His tone carried confidence again. Crockett listened without blinking. "Governor," she asked softly, "would you agree that sovereignty exists within constitutional limits?" "Of course," he said. "So, if a state law violates those limits, say, by denying access to a constitutional right, does Congress have the duty to intervene?" He hesitated. Congress has oversight, but not control. That's an interesting distinction, she said, because your testimony today sounds different from what you said under oath last year. She opened the folder. Page 142, Davis versus Florida. You acknowledge that voters in rural counties without DMV officers faced greater difficulty obtaining the ID your law requires. Is that correct? DeSantis shifted slightly in his chair. Context matters, he said, his voice tightening. On page 157, she continued. You admitted that prohibiting volunteers from offering water to voters waiting in long lines could, in your words, in extreme cases, cause elderly or disabled citizens to abandon the line. Is that correct? He exhaled slowly. I said such cases would be rare. But they exist, she pressed. And on page 201, you agreed that reducing drop boxes might create difficulties for voters with demanding work schedules. That's 3 instances where your laws make it harder for eligible citizens to vote. So, Governor, which version should we believe? Your sworn testimony or your statement today? The silence that followed was heavy. Every eye was on him. DeSantis looked toward the chairman, then back at her. Representative, you're twisting isolated statements into something larger, he said. No law is perfect, but these examples don't show suppression. Crockett leaned closer. Governor, I've read hundreds of depositions. This isn't twisting. This is truth. You admitted those barriers exist. The question is, why are you denying them now? The audience could feel the power dynamic tilt. The governor, who entered the room as the aggressor, was now defending himself. But she wasn't finished. Governor, are you familiar with Mary Wilson from Gadsden County? She asked, holding up a sheet. She's 78 years old. When her ID was rejected, she had to travel 67 miles to get a new one. She doesn't drive. She paid $120 to hire a ride. Her week's grocery budget. Is that what you call a reasonable effort? He opened his mouth, but she continued. James Hernandez, a paramedic in Miami, used to vote at a drop box near his station. You closed it. Now he works 12-hour shifts and can't vote during business hours. Is his right to vote another edge case? The room was silent except for her voice. She picked up another paper. Governor, your office has prosecuted exactly 153 cases of voter fraud out of 50 million ballots in 23 years. That's 0.003%. Yet your laws have kept thousands from voting. What's the real threat here? Fraud or freedom? DeSantis leaned back, jaw tight. Even one fraudulent vote undermines confidence, he said. And even one legal vote denied undermines democracy, she replied instantly. The words landed like a hammer. She wasn't shouting, but the calm conviction in her tone made the message louder than any yell. For the first time, he didn't interrupt. She turned another page. In your deposition, page 276, you admitted that you can't measure how many fraudulent votes your laws prevented. You said those figures would be speculative. So you can't prove fraud prevention, but you can prove voter suppression. How do you call that balance? DeSantis exhaled through his nose, the way people do when they're trying not to lose control. Representative, maintaining voter confidence matters more than theoretical inconvenience. She raised an eyebrow. Confidence? Before your new laws, 79% of Florida voters trusted the system. After you passed them, it dropped to 71. Confidence went down, not up. So who exactly are you protecting? The chairman tried to interrupt, but she held up one hand. Mr. Chairman, just one final question. She looked back at DeSantis. Governor, you took an oath to defend the Constitution, not to defend flaws in your own laws. The 15th Amendment protects against racial discrimination in voting. The 19th guarantees women's suffrage. The 26th protects young voters. The 14th promises equal protection to all. Your laws violate those promises by making some citizens fight harder for their rights than others. That's not sovereignty. That's exclusion. DeSantis's lips parted, but no sound came. The silence that followed was so deep that even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. She closed her folder, her expression calm. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she said, leaning back. The gavel struck, but no one moved. People knew they had just witnessed something rare. A confrontation not about politics, but about principle. As the hearing recessed, reporters ran to the hallway, phones already buzzing. Clips of the exchange would soon flood every screen in America. Some would call it a clash of egos. Others would call it a defense of democracy. But one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The storm that started in that quiet chamber was about to spread far beyond those walls. Because what happened next would not only shake careers, it would rewrite the national conversation about who truly gets to vote in America. And that's where part 2 begins. Because what happened next would not only shake careers, it would rewrite the national conversation about who truly gets to vote in America. And that's where part 2 begins. Outside the Senate building, the cold marble steps were crowded with reporters shouting questions, microphones thrust forward like spears. The clip of Jasmine Crockett confronting Governor DeSantis had already hit social media feeds before the recess ended. News alerts flashed across phones nationwide. The image of DeSantis, pausing mid-sentence as Crockett read from his own sworn testimony, was everywhere. People in cafes, offices, and living rooms replayed it again and again. Some called it courage, others called it ambush. But everyone was talking. Inside a nearby hallway, Crockett walked calmly toward her office. Staffers tried to speak, but she kept her pace steady, her expression unreadable. She knew what that exchange meant. It wasn't just a viral moment. It was evidence, precision, and years of preparation colliding with power on live television. Across town, inside the Florida delegation's private room, DeSantis sat with his aides, watching the replay on a muted screen. His jaw was tight. Every pause, every flicker of hesitation looked worse in slow motion. "We need to get ahead of this," one aide said softly. "Get ahead of what?" DeSantis snapped. "Facts." The aide didn't answer. Another voice chimed in. "Calmer. Governor, you came off defensive. We can fix that with context. Stress integrity. Stress balance." DeSantis nodded slowly. He wasn't angry at the aides. He was angry at himself. He had underestimated her. For the first time in months, he had been forced into defense by someone he had dismissed as a junior congresswoman. He turned off the television and stared at the reflection in the black screen. "We'll clarify," he said quietly. "We'll clarify everything." That night, television anchors replayed the confrontation from every angle. On one network, a commentator said, "This was more than politics. It was constitutional cross-examination." On another, a host called it grandstanding. But the public response told a different story. Hashtags like Jasmine Crockett vs. DeSantis and Right to Vote trended nationwide. Retired teachers, veterans, nurses, ordinary Americans posted their own experiences of struggling to vote. What began as a single hearing had turned into a national conversation about obstacles at the ballot box. By morning, reporters camped outside Crockett's office. When she stepped out, microphones surrounded her like a wall. "Representative, was your exchange planned?" Someone shouted. "Did you intend to corner the governor?" She smiled faintly. "I intended to ask questions," she said. "That's my job." "Do you think he lied?" Another asked. "I think he contradicted himself," she replied. "And the record speaks louder than I do." Her tone was calm, not triumphant. That calmness was part of her strength. It made everything she said sound measured and undeniable. Meanwhile, DeSantis prepared for damage control. His communications team drafted statements emphasizing his commitment to secure and fair elections. He scheduled an interview with a sympathetic news outlet to reframe the exchange. "We're going to focus on results," his chief of staff said. "Turnout numbers, fraud prevention, leadership." But DeSantis knew facts weren't enough now. This was emotional. It was about trust. The next day, he walked into the interview studio with his usual composure, but the lights felt hotter than usual. The host greeted him warmly, yet the first question was sharper than expected. "Governor, many Americans saw you appear cornered during that hearing. Do you regret any of your statements?" He smiled carefully. "Not at all. Representative Crockett and I share a passion for protecting democracy. We simply disagree on the method. She raised concerns worth discussing. I'm always open to improving access, but not at the expense of integrity." The answer sounded balanced, almost generous. His aides nodded off camera. But social media wasn't as forgiving. Viewers clipped his phrase, "I'm always open to improving access," and flooded it with comments like, "Then fix your laws." Within hours, analysts began calling it a pivot, a soft retreat from hardline rhetoric. In Washington, Crockett worked late, her desk covered in letters from citizens. Some were typed, others handwritten on lined paper. A woman from Georgia wrote, "I watched you speak, and I cried. My mum used to wait in line for hours to vote before she passed. Thank you for speaking for her." Crockett read every word, quietly placing the letters in a growing stack. She wasn't interested in fame. She was interested in follow-through. She met with her legal team, revising parts of her bill based on the issues the hearing had revealed. "We'll tighten the language," she said. "Make sure no one can twist it as federal overreach. Focus on access, not control." Her staff nodded. They admired how she turned conflict into momentum. But beyond the Capitol walls, political strategists were doing their own calculations. One evening, in a quiet restaurant not far from the Hill, two senior senators, one Democrat, one Republican, met over dinner. "She's sharp," the Republican said, cutting his steak slowly. "Not loud, just sharp." People listened to that. The Democrat nodded. "She's dangerous for both sides. She doesn't grandstand. She builds records." And DeSantis. "He'll recover, but he'll remember her name." That prediction proved true. 3 days later, DeSantis appeared at a press conference in Tallahassee. The room was packed. "Florida will review certain provisions of our election laws," he announced. "We're committed to ensuring that every eligible voter can participate." Reporters' hands shot up instantly. "Governor, is this a response to the congressional hearing?" He smiled. "It's a response to listening. Good governance means constant improvement." The answer was smooth, but everyone knew what had prompted it. Back in Washington, Crockett watched the clip from her office. One of her aides smiled. "Looks like he blinked." He adjusted. Crockett said, "That's progress." That week, newspapers across the country ran headlines about Florida's unexpected review. Some framed it as compromise, others as quiet retreat, but the public saw something different. They saw accountability. Law professors began discussing the exchange in classrooms, analyzing it as an example of constitutional oversight done right. A Georgetown scholar told his students, "Notice her strategy. No personal attacks, just documented contradictions. That's how you win minds in law and politics." Across the country, in living rooms and libraries, people rewatched the exchange. It became a lesson, not just in law, but in clarity, the power of evidence over emotion. Meanwhile, political talk shows speculated about future implications. Could this hearing change the trajectory of voting rights reform? One anchor asked. "It already has." replied a guest analyst. The conversation shifted from abstract ideology to real people. That's the power of human stories in law. By the end of the week, both Crockett and DeSantis saw their names trending again, but for very different reasons. She was praised for professionalism, he for restraint, yet both knew the story wasn't over. The next phase would be about action, not words. Inside the Senate, committees quietly began discussing amendments to Crockett's bill. Some senators who had been skeptical now wanted to be part of it. They saw public interest surging. They saw voters writing letters. Momentum was building. Late one night, Crockett sat alone in her office, the Capitol dome glowing through her window. She thought about her grandmother, who used to tell her, "The law means nothing if people can't reach it." She smiled softly, whispering those words again. Then she picked up her pen and began drafting changes. At the same hour, hundreds of miles away, DeSantis walked along a quiet Florida beach. The sea breeze tugged at his shirt. He replayed the hearing in his head, not the politics, but the faces behind the examples she'd used. The elderly woman, the paramedic, the workers who couldn't reach polling places. He wondered if small adjustments could protect access without losing control. Pride resisted the thought, but conscience whispered anyway. Politics had taught him that humility, though rare, could be strategic. Back in Washington, the morning papers featured new stories. Crockett's bill gains bipartisan momentum, and Governor DeSantis signals willingness to review laws. Comment sections buzzed with cautious hope. For once, Americans weren't just arguing, they were reflecting. Polls showed increased awareness of voter access issues. Civic groups launched campaigns to simplify registration and extend voting hours. For the first time in years, reform didn't seem impossible. Still, behind every headline, both politicians knew this fragile progress could collapse with one wrong move. When the committee reconvened 2 weeks later, cameras returned. The room felt familiar, yet changed. DeSantis entered with a neutral expression, not the confident grin from before. Crockett greeted him politely. "Governor," she said, "thank you for returning." "Representative," he nodded, "thank you for challenging me to be better." The statement surprised everyone. The hearing that followed was quieter, more focused on solutions. They discussed data transparency, outreach programs, and federal grants for rural voter access. It wasn't dramatic, but it was productive. And yet, beneath that cooperation, something larger was forming. A realization that this conversation wasn't ending here. The nation had seen a glimpse of what accountability looked like, and people weren't going to forget. As the session closed, reporters hurried to send updates. One asked Crockett if she believed change was coming. She paused, thinking. "Change is already happening," she said. "It starts when truth gets louder than fear." Her words traveled far beyond that room. In living rooms across America, people nodded. It felt like the beginning of something bigger, a new chapter in how the country talked about rights, power, and truth. But behind the calm, both knew politics never rests. Every victory invites a new challenge. Somewhere, strategies were already being drawn for the next confrontation, one that would test not just policy, but character. Because the fight for the vote, for equality, for the soul of democracy was far from over. And as the next session of Congress approached, new witnesses, new revelations, and new stakes were about to turn that quiet progress into the next great political storm. That storm is where Part 3 begins. That storm is where Part 3 begins. The next session of Congress opened under grey skies, a steady rain tapping the Capitol dome like a slow drumbeat. Inside, the air was heavier than before. Cameras lined the marble hallways. Commentators whispered about what new revelations could come. The hearing room filled again. Senators, aides, journalists, and citizens who had waited hours just to get a seat. Some came curious, some skeptical, some simply wanting to see history unfold. Governor Ron DeSantis entered first. His expression steady, no smile, no nerves, just focus. A few minutes later, Representative Jasmine Crockett walked in, holding her notes tight against her chest. The two nodded politely, but everyone felt the charged silence between them. This wasn't hostility. It was mutual awareness that what happened today would live on in history books. When the chairman gavelled the room to order, every camera light blinked on. Crockett began her questioning softly, almost conversationally, asking about the review Florida had announced. DeSantis answered carefully, his tone humbler than weeks before. "We're making improvements," he said, "to ensure full access." But Crockett's next line cut deeper. "Governor, progress is good," she said, "but acknowledgement matters. You changed your policies. Will you acknowledge that those changes came because citizens proved they were struggling under the old ones?" The governor paused. The microphones picked up his inhale. Then, surprisingly, he said, "Yes, Representative. We heard their stories, and we adjusted." The room shifted. Some reporters raised eyebrows. Others scribbled notes furiously. It wasn't concession. It was growth. Crockett nodded slowly. Then maybe today isn't about blame. Maybe it's about the system learning from its own mistakes. A rare murmur of approval rippled through the chamber. For a moment, it felt like Washington had remembered how to listen. But not everyone was ready for peace. A senator from another state leaned in, accusing Crockett of pushing federal control. She met the attack with calm precision. "Sir," she said, "I'm pushing constitutional compliance. There's a difference." The crowd murmured again. Even those who disagreed couldn't ignore her composure. The hearing stretched for hours. Charts, witnesses, testimonies. But what people remembered most wasn't the data. It was the tone. Two rivals who had once clashed were now discussing compromise on live television. Toward the end, DeSantis surprised everyone again. "Representative Crockett," he said, "if your committee's willing, Florida will volunteer as a pilot state for expanded rural voter programs." Gasps spread through the room. Crockett looked genuinely stunned. "That's unexpected," she said. He smiled faintly. "You made a fair case." The gavel struck again as the chairman concluded the hearing, calling it an example of constructive oversight. The applause that followed was brief but real. Outside, journalists ran to the steps, their umbrellas glistening with rain. "This is new," one anchor said into her camera. "Real dialogue in Congress, remember that." Overnight, every network replayed the exchange. Commentators described it as a rare moment of accountability, meeting empathy. A historian on a late-night broadcast said, "It showed that courage isn't always shouting louder. Sometimes it's listening longer." Across the country, people who had stopped believing in government watched with renewed curiosity. In coffee shops, veterans nodded quietly. In libraries, retired teachers discussed the amendments over newspapers. In small-town diners, couples talked about it between refills of coffee. The debate had turned into something larger than two politicians. It had become a mirror, reflecting what democracy could still be when honesty overpowered ego. Weeks later, the revised Federal Voter Protection Act reached the Senate floor. It passed with support from both parties. A small majority, but enough to make history. The bill didn't federalize elections. It strengthened standards that every state could meet while keeping local control. It offered funding for accessibility, rural outreach, and transparency audits. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The kind that starts quietly and lasts. When presidents signed it into law, he quoted Crockett's own words, "The Constitution doesn't protect only the rights of Americans who are convenient to accommodate. It protects all Americans. Applause echoed across the East Room, but Crockett, standing in the back, simply smiled and whispered, "That's for every voter who never gave up." Months later, a news documentary revisited the entire story. Viewers watched the slow-motion footage again, the moment DeSantis paused, the moment Crockett leaned forward, the moment truth slipped past politics. Even years later, that image still symbolized accountability. Law schools used it as a case study. Professors said, "This is how evidence defeats rhetoric." DeSantis, meanwhile, continued as governor, more measured, more aware. He quietly signed new state programs, expanding ID access and early voting hours. He never mentioned Crockett by name, but observers didn't need him to. The impact was visible, and Jasmine Crockett, now recognized nationwide, continued her work. She spoke at universities, not about politics, but about preparation. "Facts are your armor," she told young law students. "When power meets evidence, truth wins." Her voice always stayed calm, her lessons always simple. In interviews, she avoided self-praise. "I didn't win," she said once. "The Constitution did." Those words spread across social media, reaching millions. It wasn't a slogan, it was a reminder. In the end, what began as a tense clash between two people became a national reflection on integrity. It showed that even in a divided nation, the truth can still find its way through noise. And it proved that one steady voice, armed with preparation and courage, can shake the walls of power without ever raising its tone. As years passed, the clip remained one of the most replayed moments in congressional history. Generations later, students would watch it and ask, "Was politics really like that back then?" And teachers would smile and say, "Yes." And that's how it started to change. The sun set over the Capitol that evening, turning the dome gold against a clear sky. In her office, Crockett packed her notes into a drawer. The folder still read, "Davis View, Florida, excerpts." She placed her hand on it for a moment, whispered a quiet prayer for the people whose stories filled those pages, and turned off the lights. Down the hall, footsteps faded. History doesn't always end with fireworks. Sometimes it ends with calm, quiet resolve. The kind that tells you the fight was worth it. The kind that leaves hope alive. And as the screen fades to black, a gentle voice says, "Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if you believe that truth still matters, and that democracy deserves defenders, please take a second to like this video, share it with someone who still believes in fairness, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one." Your support helps us keep telling the truth, one story at a time. The music swells softly, the screen fades, and the final words appear. Truth, courage, Constitution,